So basically nobody's a journalist. Alright, that's not completely true. Journalists do exist, but they aren't the people that you think they are. Let's deal with the basic definition before we move on to why it actually matters. Merriam-Webster defines journalism as the collection and editing of news for presentation through the media. But since the internet has made the media into pretty much anyone with a cell phone, that definition is kind of useless. After all, somewhere between 20 and 33% of Americans admit to getting the majority of their news from social media. So yeah, by that definition, I'm a journalist. You're probably a journalist, and so is pretty much everyone else.
I am a serious journalist.
Wikipedia provides a slightly more useful definition, saying, a journalist is an individual that collects or gathers information in the form of text, audio, or pictures, processes them into a newsworthy form, and disseminates it to the public. See, now there's a qualifier. You can't just blast information into the void. Now it has to be newsworthy. But what counts as newsworthy? To determine what and how news should be published, I turned, not surprisingly, to a code of ethics. Well, 21 codes of ethics actually, and they all had some very important things in common. Because it's one of the most widely recognized and is quite well written, I'm going to be referencing and quoting from the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. Though I also really like the one from the Radio Television Digital News Association. You know, in case you're into that kind of thing. These codes of ethics tell us exactly what's considered a newsworthy form, and it didn't take long to see that we're failing in a lot of ways. One item from the Seek Truth and Report It section of the Code of Ethics states that journalists should provide context, take special care not to misrepresent or oversimplify in promoting, previewing, or summarizing a story. And yes, previewing includes headlines. Honestly, the mainstream media did a pretty good job of this on their actual websites. I was pleasantly surprised. Their headlines all show the bias that we expect them to based on their demographics, but they weren't needlessly inflammatory. Their YouTube videos, however, were a different story. It took me about 3 seconds to find examples on both sides of the political aisle that were exaggerated, misleading, or downright insulting. These headlines also show some pretty sneaky workarounds to another principle in the codes of ethics, which is to label advocacy and commentary. This is an example of a headline that technically does that. Technically. But it does it in a way that doesn't really make it clear that this is just someone's opinion. Our brains react very differently to just adding a name to the beginning or end of a sentence, as opposed to a clear label like this one that expressly states Pfizer exec denies, which makes it much more obvious what the source is, what the source's bias is, and that everything following is an opinion. I know it feels like I'm nitpicking, but this is actually really important. The core principle of ethical journalism is that your words matter. And even just adding or subtracting a word here or there greatly impacts the way we interpret that message. Each of these messages, even if it's just a headline, subtly impacts our opinion and our worldview. And dear goodness, are we bombarded by an ungodly amount of messages like these. It's estimated that each day we consume 74 gigabytes of information from all the various devices surrounding us. For perspective, that's the same amount of information as 750 dictionaries. Now, of course, we don't actually process and store all of that information, but it still makes an impact, even if just subconsciously. That's one of the reasons the main way to make money on the internet is with eyeballs on advertisements. So everyone is constantly competing for your attention, including me. That's why these titles matter so much. Choosing to intentionally abandon inflammatory or misleading headlines can cost publishers big dollars, so you can learn a lot about the integrity of a news source based just on their titles and headlines. One other common theme across all the codes of ethics is summarized by the SPJ code as avoid conflicts of interest, real or perceived, and deny favored treatment to advertisers, donors, or any other special interests, and resist internal and external pressure to influence coverage. And this is another area that is very concerning, because journalists are actually openly challenging the idea of fair and unbalanced reporting. According to Pew Research Center, somewhere between 50 and 70% of journalists believe that all sides of an issue don't deserve or need to be covered. The numbers are high across all journalists, but it is particularly high among younger journalists, those who publish for a primarily online source, and those who lean left on the political spectrum. But regardless of your political persuasion, the idea that anyone, let alone some 23-year-old with a crusade and a laptop, feels like it's their job to decide what information you have access to is absolutely terrifying, which explains why the public trust in the media is at an all-time low. In fact, the political talk shows that many people consider the news are so filled with opinion, conjecture, and banter that a court actually determined that any reasonable viewer would watch it with an appropriate amount of skepticism, which is why political pundits can't easily be sued for slander or libel for their opinions. That's right. Much of what we consider the mainstream media has almost legally been deemed not journalism. Here's the good news. Real journalists do exist. Amidst the many non-journalists like comedians, talk show hosts, influencers, and pundits that all proclaim the news without even an attempt at journalistic integrity, the real journalists are out there. But you have to look for them, because they aren't writing clickbait headlines that go viral as easily. They aren't stoking fear and hate and worry, which unfortunately means they often get less clicks. I recently sat down with one of these journalists for an episode of my podcast, and she said that your best bet for finding unbiased, balanced news is to look close to home. Local news is where it's at. Obviously, not all local news is great, but at least you can do something about it. You can talk to them. Visit their office, get to know the reporters, ask questions about their policies and coverage. As Joe Foote said in an opinion column in the Oklahoman, a good publisher's heartbeat is the heartbeat of a community. We may not be able to do much about the bias and divisiveness of the media mega conglomerates, but we can do something a little closer to home by finding and supporting the local journalists that support our communities and do news right. If we can give more attention, and by association ad revenue, to the good guys, it can make the world a little bit of a better place.